What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to be doing some much needed maintenance to my Shapeoko Pro XXL desktop CNC machine. Let's get to work. I need to replace the MDF slats that make up the wasteboard on my CNC machine because I've surfaced it down so many times it's about to hit the metal T-tracks that hold my clamps. This is actually the original MDF that came with the machine, and if you look at it closely, you can see that it's seen a whole lot of projects and it's just time for a new wasteboard. In addition to replacing all the MDF, I'm also going to make a new fence, which I think is a really important feature to have on a CNC machine if you're doing this as a hobby. It just makes setup a whole lot easier because your X and Y points are always constant, meaning that you only have to set your Z height for each of your projects, and I'll show you how to do that as well. In addition to all of that, I'm also going to do some general maintenance to the Shapeoko by oiling it and cleaning it free of dust. So yeah, let's get into it. Before I could do anything on this project, I needed to pull my table out from the corner where it sits. And this took a few minutes because this machine and table combined are not very light. That's heavy. Once I was able to fully walk around my machine, I used my compressor, which is actually mounted underneath my machine, to remove all of the dust so that I had a little bit cleaner of a working environment. I do plan on coming back later in this video and doing a more in-depth cleaning process, but we'll get to that in a bit. With less dust blowing in my face, I removed the screws that hold my fence in place and threw that out because I'm going to make a completely new one later in the video. And finally, I removed all the MDF slats and made sure to hold on to the bolts so that I could replace them later. So now that the MDF is actually off the machine, I can start building the new slats that are going to replace them. This is one of the older ones, and it's about 40 inches long by 3 inches wide. There is a little slop in that, if you can hear it. I think it's about, almost 1/8 of an inch slack in between these T-tracks. I thought about extending it to make it more snug, but I think I'm just going to keep it the same so that I can use this as an exact template a little bit easier. Speaking of templates, I'm going to use this to mark where the 4 holes belong, and I have to use a Forstner bit on these holes because the bolt head is recessed so that the cutter head doesn't run into it while it's carving. Other than that, they're going to look pretty similar with one big exception, which I will show you right now. You may have noticed that on the original MDF wasteboard, the area that was surfaced didn't actually extend all the way to the back of the machine. This is due to the fact that the gantry is limited on how far it can go back on the rails that it sits on. You can see that the cutter head right here is perfectly in line with the ridge on the MDF slat, and that's because this is the furthest limit of the machine. The issue with that ridge is that if you want to carve anything that's larger than your wasteboard, when you rest it on the machine, it'll be propped up at an angle as it sits on that ridge. You need everything on these machines to be as flat and straight as possible, so that just won't work. In order to combat that, the new slats will be cut just shy of that ridge so that the entire wasteboard can be surfaced. Let's get cutting. Cutting the MDF down to size was easy enough after using one of the originals to set the width on my table saw. Next, I used a transfer punch to mark the hole locations by laying the old slats over one of the new ones and just doing that repeatedly so all the holes are in the exact same location. With my hole locations marked, I was able to cut each one using a 12mm Forstner bit after setting a depth stop on my drill press to about 1/2 inch. And after drilling 30 holes, I was able to go back and drill 30 more using a 1/4 inch drill bit that cuts all the way through the material. I did take the time with the slats off of my CNC to make sure that all the bolts that secure the frame to the T-track were actually tight. But once that was done, I went ahead and installed all my new MDF by using an Allen wrench with my hand and not a power drill because that has the potential to strip the threads within the T-track. My MDF is installed and my machine has been moved back into its corner after a whole lot of effort, but before I moved it here, I did do some general maintenance. I started off by taking a rag and a tack cloth and trying to remove as much dust as possible within reason. It doesn't need to be perfect, but the more dust you can get, the better. Next, I went around to all the exposed bolts and screws that I could see and checked all of them to make sure they're tight. The most important screws that you should check though are on your stepper motors, because if these little set screws come loose, then all of your cuts are going to be, well, wrong. Because this machine is belt driven, I did go ahead and recheck all of my belt tensions by making sure that the set screw just catches the belt when it's fully extended. That's what the directions say to do, so that's what I do. And finally, I took some of this lubricating oil, added a little bit to a rag, and went around to all the exposed rails to add a light layer. I did read somewhere that this isn't actually the correct way to do this, but I've been doing it for 2 years now, about once a month, just with a little light coat, and it seems to work for me, so take it with a grain of salt. With all of that done, we are now ready to surface this, so let's go assign the toolpaths in Carbide Create. To surface the wasteboard, I'm using a pocketing toolpath that uses this 1-inch surfacing bit. A good tip while using this bit is that if you're using a bit setter, you should have it disabled. Because the cutter head is outside of the area that touches the touch probe, all of your measurements are going to be incorrect. After installing the bit and setting my Z0 height with the bit 0, I start the pocket toolpath that's carving at 0.02 inches within an area that's 34 inches wide and 33.25 inches tall. Those dimensions are based off the limits of my machine, which I found out by plunging an old V-bit directly into the MDF and then measuring from side to side and from top to bottom to see how much area I needed to carve out. I didn't realize until this carve was almost finished that my bit setter was actually in the way of where the bit was going to go, so you can see me in the bottom right corner frantically trying to remove it before the bit crashes into it. Luckily, I'm pretty quick with a wrench. And with a fully surfaced wasteboard, we can now move on to the final step of this process, which is building a new fence from this 1/4-inch piece of plastic that I have left over from a previous project. To assign toolpaths for my fence, I input the dimensions of the plastic into Carbide Create before offsetting them by 7/8 of an inch to the inside. From there, I extended the right and top edges past the limits of the workpiece and then added a 1/4-inch circle into the bottom left-hand corner. Using the Boolean functions, I combined that square and circle into one shape and then used the line drawing tool to just outline where I wanted my fence to be. With my vectors in place, I used an outside contour toolpath that cuts all the way through the stock so that only a perfectly square fence remains. When it comes to securing this on the machine, I like to place it in the bottom left corner using a 1-2-3 block from the bottom just to make sure it's nice and square. And to make sure that this thing doesn't move anywhere, I like to countersink a whole bunch of screws into the MDF, making sure that they're within that 7/8 boundary that we set earlier. Because I'm using plastic, I should be using an O-flute, but I happened to drop it right before starting this carve, so instead I'm using an 1/8-inch downcut bit. All that means is that it takes a little bit more cleanup for me since some of the plastic sort of melted in place, but we got through it. Alright, so with everything surfaced and my fence built, I'm ready to start using my machine as normal again. I'm really happy with how this came out, and I'm excited to get back to work on building some different projects. Just make sure that before you start doing anything, you set your X and Y zeros using whatever method that you like to use, using something perfectly square in that corner. I like to use a 1-2-3 block, but anything will really work. And with that, I thank you for watching, and yeah, see you next time.